Good morning, or rather good afternoon. It's midday. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. My name is Manish Wadhwa. I am the founder of Humanity in Business. Really grateful for giving us an hour of your time, especially during so much Zooming happening. Hopefully this will be a better Zoom experience than you've had before. Very quickly, before we launch into our conversation with Stuart Taylor from Springfox, Humanity in Business is really all about leadership. I'm really passionate about what leadership looks like, and I've been telling stories of great leaders and thought leaders for the past 7 years. So really, I'm all about having a conversation and understanding what does great leadership look like. And today is going to be one of the thought leaders is going to share his perspective on that and how to engage and build trust with teams, and that's Stuart Taylor. The other part of my business, which I'm working with, is Communiteer. We're a platform that helps organizations engage their charity partners and foster deeper collaboration with the charity sector through skill volunteering. So this show is kind of brought to you by both of us, and we're collaborating to basically deliver your experience today. So thanks again for joining us. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome my colleague Stuart Taylor, who I've had the opportunity to work with, I think was it last year, Stuart, or 2 years ago?
Indeed.
Yeah, so I had a great experience with him, a great leader. I love the way he works, and I thought I'll invite him to share his story with us today. For me, trust is a really interesting conversation. I'm really passionate about trust because it's one of those things which everybody talks about and everybody presumes they have it with each other, but nobody really discusses it and actually talks about what does that exactly look like? What does the doing of trust look like? And I think that's one thing which I want to get clear from Stuart today. And I think it's the foundation of any relationship. We presume we have it because nobody talks about it, but I'm not sure how many teams and leaders actually discuss what does trust look like in a day-to-day basis from engaging stakeholders perspective, engaging teams perspective, and also really being a better leader. So I'd like to welcome Stuart Taylor. Thanks for joining us, Stuart. Really grateful for your time.
Thanks, Manish. Great to be here.
Awesome. Basically, love to hear your story, Stuart. Tell us a bit more about your background and what you got to here today over the past years, and then we can launch into a bit of a conversation.
Sure, happy to do that. Look, I started my career off in the military. I joined the military as a young, passionate 20-year-old and thoroughly enjoyed that experience. Eventually got out and went into a consulting firm and found stress levels absolutely going through the roof. Thoroughly enjoyed it, but would fall over at the end of every project and then get back up to go again.
Right.
Really tricky environment. Then I went corporate. I was with one of the large multinationals for a number of years, and again enjoyed that experience. And a few years into my time with this organisation, I started experiencing some symptoms. Right. And when I found time to go and see a doctor about this, I came out of it with a diagnosis of brain cancer.
Wow.
And on the back of that was given 2.5 years to live. And you can imagine the shock that this represented for myself, for my family, 3 kids under 5. It really took a career that was going great guns and a life that was going great guns to an abrupt halt. Wow. To totally look in the mirror to work out where would I go next, given that news.
Yeah, fascinating. So what got you there then into in this conversation around resilience and trust? What sort of brought you to this place?
Well, it was that experience that made me stop and reconsider every aspect of my life. The basics around exercise, nutrition, mindset, optimism, spirituality. And as part of that experience, I ran into a chap who was leading this area around resilience and leadership 18 years ago. And he and I decided that we would get things moving in Australia and in New Zealand to help organisations and leaders to do this stuff better. It's clearly not being done well, and I think to a degree we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah, fascinating. And so what was the conversation that moved from resilience into trust? Can you explain a bit about what's the connection there?
Well, I do see the two topics as inextricably linked. A lot of the work that we did initially was around personal resilience and resilient leadership, it doesn't take too long to then bridge that into an organizational picture around sustainable high performance. And as soon as you go in that direction, the whole concept of a fear-based organization is now part of that conversation. And when you have a fear-based organization, which unfortunately are so many organizations still, it's representing this lack of trust that exists in that organization. So to have a resilient and high performance organization, you also need a high trust organization.
Right.
And so the two actually are so close together, you can't treat them as a separate conversation. They are inextricably linked, as mentioned.
Interesting. So tell us a bit more about the trust, the framework in terms of what does actually trust involve? What does it include?
Yeah, look, I think even to start with a definition, because I think this is where many can get it wrong. To say, what is trust? Well, did I tell the truth? Did I do what I always say I was going to do? Is a very simplistic view of the concept. And I think that's where a lot of people and leaders can fall into a trap. And to say trust is about, trustworthiness, it really is only part of the question. The real test of trust is, do I take a risk based on my trustworthiness of you? So having trustworthiness is not enough. It's actually, do I take that next step and do something, expecting that I won't get a whack or a punishment or a detriment as a result of having taken that risk. That's trust.
Right.
Quite a bigger step forward than just that more, basic level.
Right, interesting. That's a really interesting concept. So, what would be the pillars of it, and how does that actually come together to actually create that trustworthiness within the organization?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Manish. As we started looking at this concept maybe 3 years ago, we did a review across all of the research that was out there, and we came up with 6 areas that dealt to that definition that I've just put forward. The first of these is the obvious one, but arguably the most important, and that is integrity. And in fact, I think this was sent out to the people that are on this call, so you'll see this front there anyway. You can follow that through. Integrity is the first one, and in essence, this is, do I do what I'll say I'll do? Do I tell the truth? Do I operate ethically and morally?
Right.
And so it's possibly the easiest one to understand, arguably the toughest one to do, particularly during challenging times. And it's interesting to see how this has unfolded during the COVID experience across each of these elements I'll take you through. Every one of them has been challenged. And I think that's conversation for today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really interested in understanding what when you're saying you're being challenged under the COVID situation, what does integrity being challenged look like?
Yeah, I think it's in terms of transparent, honest communication. It's interesting whether, as a leader, when things do come to push me against the wall, do I still come out with that authentic communication to my team, knowing that some of the news is going to be bad news, or do I try to smooth it through and as a result end up destroying that trust that comes with that point of integrity that I need to stay by? So it's an easy one to back away from, but a very quick one to lose trust on the back of. It's really is the make or break of trust.
Right. So really, you're looking for communications is a pillar of integrity. Is still critical to it, is it?
Well, it's actually a related factor. It's probably the second factor. Let's talk about that now, which is connection. And as a leader who's wanting to foster trust, how do I build this social connection through communication that goes beyond the transaction? And again, to a COVID situation, haven't we done a fantastic job of pivoting into the work from home situation? But haven't we also done a terrible job of pivoting to a place where the whole day is full of video conferencing, to the point where it just does feel a transaction and also exhausting. And I think that's what we're finding in this research we're about to publish on COVID, that the exhaustion level is through the roof. And part of that is a leader's attempt to replace that face-to-face connection with digital interaction. And so our teams are just full-time on video conference, which is not a replacement for that, tea cooler, morning tea interaction where you might be talking about the weekend and having that connection on that basis.
Yeah, right.
And so trust isn't built on transaction, it's built on social and relational connection. And that is a challenge moving forward.
Yeah. So tell me, in terms of this, like you mentioned, the COVID era, we're all sitting in our houses, and the isolation is obviously gone through the roof, and so has mental health challenges. How do you build connection then? What do we just do more Zoom calls to build that connection? I mean, how do you then foster that in a time where it's all digital?
So I don't think more Zoom calls are going to be the solution, Manish. I think that's actually only going to make things worse. We need to get creative moving forward, and even, I mean, you look at the research that is coming out of this survey that we've done. A lot of people don't want to go back to the workplace. They actually want to continue working from home, and so this is an area that does need to be solved by leaders of organisations. How do I strike that better balance on this flexible working arrangement, such that you can still build in that human connection? And the problem with our Zoom connections, I think, or our video conferencing, they're all group sessions typically.
Yep.
Doesn't mean we can't be having one-on-ones with our leaders and staff to have much more of a personal connection. Doesn't mean we can't be having walking meetings in different scenarios. Doesn't mean we can't be having some time back in the office and some time not. So there's lots of different ways to do it. But the way we're currently doing it is actually, I think, inadvertently destroying trust just due to that social isolation that you talk about. One of the emotions that showed up in that survey, by the way, was loneliness, which is really quite a stark response that represents the destruction of connection.
Interesting. So what do you think leaders should do now that they don't have a choice except Zooming? Is it more phone calls? I mean, what is the action that they need to take to build that? Since
I think at a practical level, the communication needs to be much more multimodal. I think the intention of leaders during COVID with a lot of video conferencing was right, but it needs to be much more multimodal, and that could be back to emails. It could be one-on-ones. I'm sure there's lots of different ways to do it, but this whole replacing face-to-face meetings with all-day video conferences is just not sustainable. We know, or what we have learned from the COVID experience, is the impact on the brain is substantial in terms of sitting in a Zoom meeting where you're not just like a face-to-face just working through that meeting. You are concentrating on so many different faces. Everyone's concentrating on you. You'd always need to have your game on. It's actually quite fatiguing for the brain to be in that space on an ongoing basis. So it's just not the solution.
Interesting. And also, I think what I'm hearing as well from a lot of other sources is that the ability to focus on body language and to focus on expressions and how they're moving. It's really hard to suss that out while you're on a Zoom call. So it's even harder to try to engage with someone or influence or even connect to them because of the fact that staring at a screen is not easy.
And even more than that, we've also seen that the time delay in response, albeit milliseconds, is much longer than what you would have in a face-to-face meeting. And again, it's an inadvertent destruction of trust, but it's there because you are pausing longer than we are used to. It can be perceived as maybe you don't agree, maybe there's a disconnect, literally, in that interaction. So it's funny, the artificial world we've created is potentially inadvertently destroying trust.
Yeah, interesting. Right. So really, you just have to spread the different ways of talking to and engaging people versus just a standard Zoom call. It's critical, right? Maybe more phone calls, I guess. Back to the old chat.
Yeah, phone calls, one-on-ones, and maybe it is going back to even the written word. It doesn't have to be a continual set of meetings.
Yeah.
So that's number two. Number three is one that I think all of us were challenged with that day or that night when we realised that we were in the midst of a new world with the COVID experience, and in that 24 hours, the whole world changed in terms of business, in terms of our families, and so on. And the third one is around steadiness. We know for a leader to build trust and have trust, they need to be that leader, that person that maintains a sense of calm, impulse control. You know, they're not overreacting when things don't go so well, or, you know, when things are going terribly.
Yep.
They're able to respond rather than react. And, you know, a leader who does that well, and I know a number of leaders who I would say are world class in this, they're able to take on board what is being said to them and come up with a practical resolution or coach that from their staff member, rather than go into punishment mode or, you know, a response that's less than ideal.
Yeah.
And so steadiness is so important, and it was almost a marker of resilience and leadership, all packed up in one word, that doesn't come easily. It comes with a level of maturity over time.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
And in a way, it comes back to the idea of the fear-based culture. Lack of steadiness is a beautiful way to do that. When the leader doesn't handle bad news well, everybody's done cover, not wanting to share that bad news.
Yeah, and the fact that you're online, it only exacerbates the situation because you can't really have that same engagement you have face to face. So the steadiness is probably amplified in an online environment.
It really is, and I think it's also perhaps some of the miscommunication around trust as well. That and trust isn't just leadership, trust is also coming from every person. It's an interpersonal position that in that webinar environment or in that video conference environment, everyone does, it seems, try to be at their best.
Yep.
In that environment. So the real vulnerability isn't actually shown. It's very hard to build trust if it's, you know, an artificial self that's been propped up.
Yeah, interesting. So that I totally get. I love that piece around vulnerability, which is a critical piece there. And I think there's a fine line that we talked about that at our previous sessions. Okay, and what's the other pillar there of trust, which is an important piece?
So the next one I'll move to is purpose, and it's fundamental to leadership, of course. As a leader, do I know the why? Do I know what the future is? The intention for the future? Am I communicating that well around where we're going? If I'm not actually able to define that, it's very hard to, in a way, assess what's going on now towards that future, that greater good. And trust is all about linking things to the greater good. Otherwise, you get caught up in more destructive emotions like indifference or contempt or sympathy, when really trust is built on participation and contribution to that greater good. And so purpose, which defines the answer, if you like, makes it much more aligned across a team to where the team is going. So purpose is the fourth factor that is essential.
So I guess that's kind of purpose elevates the conversation to beyond just the BAU and the task. So that kind of is the power and fuel for engagement. Is that right?
For sure. And, as someone in a team, it's actually really attractive to know that this is where we're going and this is what we're trying to achieve and this is the future, rather than it is about BAU. And, I feel like we're just plodding along and, it's more about the minutiae rather than the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And so, you can say, well, that's building respect, is it? Well, yes. But it also builds that sense of trust that we're all in this together and moving forward.
Interesting. Yeah, for me, I know in my case of uncertainty with all our events being disrupted, that my sense of purpose is actually been coming to the forefront now. Is more time than ever. I'm actually really connected to that purpose, and it's kept me still engaged in spite of what's going on around me. So I totally get that. Yeah, and
so because just to follow that through a little bit more, where purpose is lacking, it gets replaced with some really ugly emotions. And the one that I'm thinking of in particular is worry. And we see that again and again and again. You can see how this fits into the fear-based culture, how it fits into lack of resilience. In the Global Resilience Report we published the year before last, it was the primary emotion experienced by that global database, and it's also showed up significantly in our COVID survey. And so while I'm in the grip of this paralysis, if you like, there's no way I can see a way through to a better outcome. Purpose is one of the antidotes to that.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that when you have a different, higher perspective, and we talked about this at an earlier session we did last 2 weeks ago, the bigger the higher perspective you have, and it's more purposeful, you start to deal with the worry issue much more easier than you would if you had a very minute perspective and a very narrow perspective.
I certainly found it. You mentioned my story before. The work I was doing before that, I really loved it. But changing into this space on the back of my cancer journey, it was linked very much to a bigger purpose and a contribution that I wanted to make in the world that I was part of. And so it's a different dynamic in the way that you engage with your world when that's your direction.
Yeah, I hear you.
And measurement.
Interesting. Okay. And what is the other area which is involved is a part of trust?
So Manish, I saved the best one to last, and that is compassion. And it's also arguably the most controversial. Many would say compassion is soft and fluffy, and there's no time for that in our modern world. I would say to you, it is the pillar, the foundation of trust. And by compassion, I mean deep care for that other person. It is at times tough love. Yes. I care so much about you that I'm happy to have that more difficult conversation. We've set a clear purpose. There's steadiness, there's integrity. Right now, I can see you're operating over there, and we've had this conversation. We need to move back into this joint position of how do we move forward. Right. Otherwise, the bigger conversation needs to be, is there somewhere else that you can actually contribute? Because right now that's not happening here. And that conversation to me sounds like an awful conversation, but it's actually a positive conversation for the organisation, but also for that individual. Because clearly they won't be enjoying things or having their flow, and neither is the organisation. So compassion is very much that sense of being prepared to have that conversation in the interests of the greater good.
Yeah, right.
So it's unfortunately confused with sympathy. I can see you struggling. Let me save you. Let me do your work for you, which destroys trust, by the way. Sometimes some leaders will defer to indifference or contempt, whereas compassion is such a strong linkage to trust.
I hear you, and I think you're right. And we had this conversation on compassion at one of our sessions earlier. it's actually quite hard to do because people get confused around the difference between compassion and empathy and sympathy, and it becomes a bit muddy.
Yes.
But it is, the action of it is actually not just for the person, but also for the organization, and it is actually a win-win. But it's how you do it, with I think, which is the hard bit.
Yeah, and so I think getting clear on that, those three words is important. So empathy being awareness, so that person's perspective. Sympathy is, or I'm over caring for their position, at for their expense, it's for their benefit at the expense of everybody else. Compassion is a relationship of care, and so it's, to me, it's a very clear delineation. But also, in a way, I mean, people say, "Oh, difficult. Let's go and do a difficult conversations course." Well, if you're operating with compassion, you sort of kind of don't need to, because you're operating with clear boundaries of what is acceptable performance, values, behaviors, etc. That's what you're having the conversation about, not this wishy-washy, there are no boundaries, so therefore it's a sympathy conversation. It's actually a more straightforward conversation because you have agreed those boundaries beforehand.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, that's a powerful one. Are those the five? I think there's 6 areas of compassion.
Yeah, they're the
Trust.
5 that we would call linked to trustworthiness. So
Right.
if I look at all 5 of those, am I working personally to build trustworthiness in each of those 5 areas?
Right.
And we see there's 36 factors that sit underneath those that you can be working on to make that happen. But the last one, the 5+1, is trust in action. And so what am I doing to encourage that other person to take that risk and know that they'll be treated well on the other side of that? And so this is the I guess the ultimate level that says I'm happy to do something as a result of that trustworthiness. So it really can only be tested in the field of battle. And I suspect there's been a lot of trust bedded down or destroyed through the COVID process.
Yeah.
Because of this last one. How did that leader respond when that staff member or that other person took a risk?
I hear you. So it would be really great to kind of bring this to life through some, whether you have a story or an example of any of these parts of trust that are so critical to making it happen. What does that look like from a leader perspective, from a doing perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting, and obviously we talk in a lot of different organisations and different sectors and so on. Now, one that comes to mind for me is one that's not as intuitive as you would think. And that's in the professional services area. So I think law firms or accounting firms. And this is an actual conversation that I had a couple of years ago around trust and specifically around compassion. And the conversation was along the lines of, well, how do you work with each other as partners in this firm? You are each, have equity in this organisation, and how do you work with each other, particularly when one of the partners is not performing up to standards? So, what do you do? How do you handle that? What's your approach?
Right.
And the feedback was, oh well, we deal with it, we sort it out. And I said, oh, okay. So, how many partners have been moved on because of poor performance? And the response was, well, none. Oh, okay, that's interesting. So how have you actually dealt with that poor performance in that example? And we started to get in the conversation around compassion. Are you actually having compassionate conversations, or are you actually having sympathy conversations?
Right.
And the extent to which it's an ongoing sympathy leadership style says it's very hard to build trust as a partnership group. To have a conversation with that partner who isn't actually performing at the level that has been agreed. Now we're actually getting into a true performance-based and sustainable performance-based organisation. And so it's an interesting conversation to realise these potentially, tough organisations, as this one is in terms of its reputation, were operating with more sympathy than they were with this thing called compassion, which
Yeah,
I
right.
really interesting to become aware that that's the case.
So what would that look like? So when you knew the partner wasn't performing, what did they actually do to then, yeah, deal with that situation? What kind of conversation was had? Was it? Oh, I guess I'm not sure you're privy to that, but what did you
No,
recommend?
no, you see it there, but I've seen it in other organisations as well. In terms of what was actually happening, was either targets would be reduced, others would be brought in to pick up the slack.
Right.
Either way, that poor performance was excused in some way, shape, or form. When reality is perhaps a more positive leadership style would have been to understand why. So it's empathy, understand why
Yep.
it was being missed. Was it because the target was unrealistic? Was it a skills issue? Is this partner in the wrong part of the firm, or ultimately, perhaps it's time for that person to move on to a part of their career.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
there's some options. The sympathy option really unsustainable. Not to mention, just breeds disrespect from the other partners.
Interesting. So really, it's about having that deeper conversation to go a bit deeper to understand what's really going on for that person and be curious and take some time to be curious to understand what's at play here for that particular partner, so that then you might find out, oh my God, I don't know, they have some other challenges which we know nothing about.
And you know what this and that is the essence of empathy. It's also wanting to understand that. It's interesting when you look at the whole uh, idea of sympathy that I'm referring to here, that is alive and well, and unfortunately is alive and well in so many organisations. It is the two-edged sword. Sympathy and contempt operate together. They're both this sense of I'm great and I'm judging you. You're not so great. You're struggling. Or in contempt, I think you're pathetic. So it's interesting the hierarchy that's involved there. Whereas compassion is actually saying, I do care about you. Let's see if we can work this out to get a solution. If not, let's help you to find somewhere where you can actually thrive.
Interesting.
It's a completely different interaction. One builds trust, one does not.
Yeah, got it. Got it. And so did you see any shift from that partner in the end? Did you see any performance changes afterwards?
So what happened with this particular firm, and I was working with the executive team, not the actual partners themselves,
Okay.
was say, let's start to build this into the partner leadership training
Right.
as specific modules of how do you coach your staff, how do you coach your partners that report to you, and so it was built into that process as a result of that. And
Interesting.
it's not as though we're talking about how to, in their case, improve the way you do tax law. It's much more, I think, much more complex when you're starting to involve the psychology and sociology around trust. But you do need to start somewhere.
Yeah, right. So in terms of, I guess, your experience around, and you've been consulting for a long time, what have you seen the number one challenge leaders face around building trust? I mean, you've got the framework now, and we know the different elements of it. Where do you see the hardest piece for leaders, and where have you potentially seen most leaders fall down? And what's the challenge there? What do you think is the hardest bit?
It's a really good question, Melissa. It's become even more stark having. In fact, we're just about to publish the code this Monday coming up. And one of the insights in this survey is around the delusion surrounding trust. And the finding from the survey make very clear that leaders believe the trust levels of their staff is X. the staff members think their leadership is much lower than that. And so this sense of disconnect between a leader's opinion versus a reality is quite different. In fact, double. And so the survey talked about, I think, 16% decline in trust during COVID for their staff. Staff members reported 32%. So I'm talking a significant shift. You can imagine now you mix into that the whole isolation and working from home. You're trying to operate a business with that significant extra number of people that are, on the verge of disconnection or have disconnected.
Yeah, wow.
So, again, back to the empathy piece, I suppose, but how well do you understand that trust connection? Or are you living in the delusion that it's in place, it's fine, now let's march ahead? I don't think enough work is done in establishing these trust factors that have just gone through. It's almost like, yeah, it's there, I'm a good person, now let's get moving.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I think sorry, you go.
No, so I guess what I was keen to also understand is, now that we know that there's such a gap between, what leaders perceive and what their teams perceive, what do leaders, we talked about a bit about the connection piece and what leaders need to do in our connection. Is that the only thing in terms of action leaders need to do? So how do you suddenly wake up and say, right, I need to build more trust with my team? Is the first step connection, or is it the first step iterating my purpose again, or is it first step is around being more in integrity? What is the first step look like for a leader who wants to lift the numbers from 30% to a better number?
The experience that we've had, Manish, is working with leadership teams, is it will differ for everyone around that table. And I think that's the important piece to be aware of.
Right.
I mentioned 36 factors that sit underneath these six levels. The assessment that we do with leaders around that model, and we actually use our own 360 assessment tool to do that.
Right.
Allows each leader to go, well, you know what, my top 3 or my top 5 areas are this, whereas my colleague over here, actually, he's got those ones nailed. What he needs to work on is that. And it's a practical 2 or 3 practical things against those top priorities that will be different for each person. If my issue is I'm fantastic at the connection piece, and I'm at every social event. I'm working on all sorts of ways to have a relational experience with my people. That's fantastic. But, when things go poorly, my first response is to have a complete anger-based flip out because this is a terrible disaster. Well, you know what? That might be where you want to spend some time working, because every time you do that, people only turn up to that social event because they're afraid what you might do to them if you don't.
Right.
so it's horses for courses, I'm sure of it. And, equally, if I'm not operating with compassion, it's just a culture that I've created, which is much more around, a sympathy culture, which is, some would call that jobs for the boys, or it could be a friendship culture. People would know that that's the style that I'm working with, and that's got to be my number one priority, to take a much firmer position to shift that. And that's probably the biggest one to shift. If integrity is the issue, there's probably not too many ways to dance around this one. Some very practical but obvious ones here around integrity. Do I actually tell lies? Do I deliver on the promises that I give? Do I do things ethically? It's I'm not sure how else to make that more practical, other than to say you need to step up and change your behaviour.
Right.
The other ones, it's interesting when you look at trust. I think in general, a lot of people say that you're either a trustworthy person or you're not. Well, actually, it might be the things you are doing inadvertently that can be changed, like my communication strategy, like compassion, that will change that profile enormously and relatively quickly. So there are lots of practical things to do. It is not said and done.
Yeah, interesting. Fair enough. The question there from the group is, do you assess the individual, or is it in a group meeting or survey? Is it done as a group, or is it very much on an individual basis?
Yeah, so it's a 360 based on the individual, by the group or others they choose to do that review. And so it tends to be, 10 to 15 people doing that review of that person's choosing. So there's obviously some level of bias as to who they choose. Having said that, the assessment then allows that whole team to get a group de-identified view of where the leadership team sits. And so they explore their joint opportunities. But I would also say, this is not like measuring your fitness, which obviously we do lots of, or your stress level, or it's actually, it is not something to take on lightly. That team needs to be in a reasonable position to be having this bigger picture, more spiritual conversation around trust, because it is a pretty, soulful or spiritual topic that does ask bigger questions about self. And so it needs to be handled well in terms of the assessment, but also in terms of the debrief, to make sure you're coming out of it with practical, useful things rather than going, oh, geez, I can never recover from this.
So it's almost there's a inherent need for some ability to be vulnerable, to be able to deal with this stuff. Otherwise, it might just be too confronting to deal with.
And look, I've seen this work beautifully when the CEO or the head of that leadership team is happy to step up and lead from that perspective, to go through that assessment, to go through that group process. Again, it's done sensitively and no sharing unless that person wants to share, but they're happy to be vulnerable in that environment.
Yep.
And even going down that process for them is one of vulnerability, because there's a high likelihood that everyone in the room has done an assessment of them. And so they are putting themselves out there to say, I want to learn from this. No. And I think this is the point, Manish, when we look at this topic of trust, it underpins leadership. It really does.
Yep.
If you haven't got trust, you actually don't have permission to lead. And so you can forget about it and just go on pretending it's okay, or you can be curious and want to understand which levers could I be pulling to improve the way that I interact with my team and my world.
Yeah, good point. And please feel free to continue with the questions as well on Zoom, on the chat room. But in the meantime, so what in this COVID era, where do you think is the most area which leaders should focus on to build that trust? We're working remotely. What do you see as something that's critical for us to do more of or less of to ensure that we are continuing to build that trust?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've been studying this from the minute the COVID, with extra focus from the minute that COVID came along, and very quickly took the view there'll be leadership teams. Perhaps there's two types of leadership teams: ones that have got this stuff sorted, and ones that hadn't prior to COVID coming about. And reflecting on the experience of those two types of teams. And, if I was to read some of the commentary, I don't know whether I've got it here to take you through that at my fingertips, but some of the commentary that came through the survey, one in particular really just struck me in a very affronting way, of my whole time working from home has been based on random spot checks from my manager just to check that I was at my desk and working. And I'm going, oh my goodness, here's an example of a team that did not have a trust relationship set up before COVID, maybe never will, based on that choice by the manager. But trust is not built on to-do lists and monitoring and micromanagement. It is, as I talked about, built on purpose, values, steadiness. And so it really concerned me to see that, and there's many examples of that statement, by the way, given the decline in trust that occurred during COVID. It really concerned me to see that, and use of the word bullying and so on was quite prevalent in a number of the comments. Having said that, there were equally a lot of comments from others who had the opposite view, and that is, wow, this is so empowering to be in this environment, and my leader has given me space to do what I need to do, and so interesting to see those there. But if I was to go around the 6 areas of the model, again, to answer your question, I think there are the obvious ones, which is around compassion. Compassion probably is the primary one, Manish, I would say.
Yep.
What I didn't say about compassion is compassion has underpinning it a high level of empowerment. And so it's not about micromanagement, random joining of your room. That's sympathy to make sure, or contempt potentially. And so that willingness to say, here's what we agree that you're going to focus on. Now let's talk about it when you need some guidance, or as you're producing an outcome out of that. That's a completely different situation. And so working on that compassion-based trust is fundamental, and the extent to which that staff members unable to step up to that outcome, then that's where training can occur, guidance can occur, or potentially over time, maybe they need to move into a different role.
Yeah, I hear you. I think compassion is, I see my friends who are working on remotely, and everyone's, as you are, working from home. And some of them are telling me that, they feel the engagement's gone up because they suddenly don't have their boss looking over their shoulder. And they just get on to deliver an outcome, but before it actually, so they don't want to go back to work. They actually feel in some way they're maybe, empowered to suddenly do what they got to do because there's no one checking in on them. But at the same time, it's almost like you have to balance that in a way which still delivers an outcome, but at the same time is empowering, if that makes sense.
It definitely isn't. The stats that came through in the survey is that 25% of the respondents don't want to return to work. So I think that's interesting. And that'll depend on different sectors as to how achievable that is. In a way, this is from a leadership perspective, as you ask the question, where should a leader be going to build trust post-COVID? If a leader's style is much more of a sympathy style, they will be struggling because they'll be flipping between sympathy and contempt. And that's where that micromanagement kicks in. So to me, that development is just so important. Am I over caring about how much my team like me versus caring and leading by outcomes rather than by activity? Quite a transformation.
Yeah, right. Is there something, so as a leader, I get that. Is there things that team members can do to support the leader and flip it around the other way to maybe have compassion from a team's perspective onto the leader? Is there a piece around that as well?
I think that's, you've hit on a really interesting point. It is so often that trust is directed at the leader and how trustworthy are they, and do I do things because I trust them? It does actually have to work both ways. And I think, there's nothing like, even if we come back to the model again and pick up even the integrity one, to say, as a staff member, do I do what I say I'll do? And am I happy to be accountable? Empowerment is interesting, but it really is only useful if the person that has been empowered is happy to pick that up and run with it. So a level of integrity, communication, connection that comes with that is not just the leader's accountability. It really is a virtuous loop that occurs when the staff member also plays that game. It falls apart when it is one way, and then the judgment falls at the feet of the leader for not being a trustworthy leader. Well, it's actually going to play both ways. That's where that sense of mutual benefit comes to bear.
Interesting. Okay. One thing I wanted to touch on before we got just about almost out of time, but the piece around purpose. And, I think a lot of companies, or most companies, may have not articulated the sense of purpose very clearly. And I know it's a challenge for most organizations. Is there a way of, I guess, bringing the purpose conversation more into leading teams now, because we are so separate and working remotely, and maybe having a smaller and linking the purpose maybe to the team level versus the organization levels? Because it's a very big word, and it's almost how do you make it relevant to a team and that team leadership of that team? Does that make sense? You know where I'm coming from?
It does. You know what? Of all the things that will change as a result of COVID, I'm going to say to you that's one that won't.
Yes.
I think it's always been the common, thread through where a leader wants to take their team, the organisation, the individual. To me, that is the common thread and has been for all time.
Right.
And in a way, it's why it does make the completion of the model around trust, because it's so fundamental to why we're doing what we are doing. What has changed perhaps is, if anything, it's amplified the need to have that more understood. Perhaps when you're in the office, it can be fudged through because you're managing it through meetings or through tasks or whatever. I think it just amplifies the need to have that much more well understood. But you're right. I mean, this idea of having a cascading purpose, again, I don't think that's new, but just more important. Organizational purpose for me, it's very hard to wrap your arms around, because it is just so, far from what I do. And so if that isn't cascaded to a team and then to my contribution to that purpose, then, it's just a poster on the wall is just breeding cynicism rather than trust.
Yeah, correct. I agree with you. And I think that's where I think maybe the leader's role now is more important in around highlighting the purpose more than ever, and constantly reminding people, because they're so disconnected in some ways remotely. That reminder of and reiteration of it is probably playing a bigger role now.
And I think that starts to bring to life, when a team does come together, is it truly just a transactional meeting, or is it asking that question, what have we done this week that's contributed to our purpose? How are we traveling as a team, individually, collectively, from a health, resilience, well-being perspective? Those sort of questions which don't tend to be asked. Instead, it's, where are we up to this project, that deadline, and so on. It's missing a huge opportunity that really, I think, is done well in those sort of connections. A lot of the milestone and task stuff can be done using plenty of other technology that we're all using. So I think focusing much more on that spiritual level can be a much more positive experience.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time. I guess I just was curious to understand from you, is there any one piece of nugget? And please, if you have any more questions online from the attendees, feel free to throw it our way. But just to wrap it up from your perspective, I guess, what's your final words around truly a trustworthy leader? I know we talked about so many pillars around compassion, purpose, etc. But I guess if there was one final word and a key message which you think is must do, or they have to action when they get off this call, what would you recommend that be?
Look, I might steal an opportunity for two. One would be links back to a little bit of what we talked about earlier, and that is empathy is the underpinning of all trust. And, a lot of the directionality of trust is the judgment of the leader as to whether they can be trusted. Actually, it's a human interaction. And if you've got stripes on your shoulders or not, can that empathy work in both directions? And I don't know whether you've realised it, but I have. Leaders are not perfect, and just because they did that does not mean they're unable to be trusted. It's a question of, do I understand what's going on there? So I guess, allowing some level of humanity to this concept is really important. Most people aren't evil, and yet when we decide they're not trustworthy, it's almost partly what we are saying. So I think it's a level of caution there around that, I think is key. And perhaps I could read from one of my favourite quotes around trust. Manish, is my second comment. Trust is the currency of good business. Research has found that positive teams that trust each other are more productive, creative, and resilient, which helps improve the organisation's overall effectiveness. It's a Harvard Business Review quote. It really is that important. And close also saying, I'm very happy to send out our white paper on leadership trust to everyone that's come along to the session.
Awesome.
And talk further about that if that's useful.
Awesome. Well, fantastic. Well, we're pretty much out of time, but that's been awesome, Stuart. Really grateful for your time and giving us sharing some of your wisdom with us. That's been truly gold. Fascinating conversation. I think for me, it's been the fact that we take it so much for granted that, everyone trusts each other and everything's fine. But when you start doing things like the surveys and you start to really dig a bit deeper to know what does that look like, it's actually not really there. It's more a lip service. And thank you for clarifying what's needed for teams and leaders to be more effective. So really appreciate your time, Stuart. Thank you so much for joining us.
Wonderful.
And thank you all for giving us 1 hour of your time. Extremely grateful for your time because I know you might be zoomed out, but at least you're here. Hopefully you found that really interesting and worthwhile and some practical examples of what you can do next. I look forward to welcoming you back again on Wednesday at 12 p.m. with our next speaker. In the meantime, please have a great day, have a great week, and build trust. And hopefully you'll action some of the stuff you've learned today. And look forward to your feedback in the future. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.